All right, what's up, everyone? Shane, aka Wild Poker, coming back at you with another hand history review. Once again, we're doing a hand that I played quite a while ago, actually now, but it was one that I posted in my own Discord, trying to get some feedback from the guys that are in my Discord, because this is a hand that actually at the time I played it, I wasn't really certain what the best line was going to be here. I was pretty confident that the line that I ended up taking was going to be plus EV, but it's always good whether you have a line that works or doesn't work. You always want to be checking yourself if you're not sure what the best line is, and trying to get some feedback from it and trying to study it on your own. So this is one that I was actually very curious about myself, and because of that, even though it's a spot that I think is very rare in poker, because as you guys will see, I'm taking an incredibly exploitative line here. I think it's still, when you run into these kind of curious spots, it's good to check, and I think it's kind of fun to check because these are the interesting spots in poker. So real quick, I'll show you the hand. I'll show you some of the comments that came back, and then my comments on those comments, and then we'll get into some of the analysis. Yeah, it should be fun. So real quick on this guy, we were playing. This was in the fast forward pool on Party Poker, and he was probably playing 2 or 3 tables. I think I was playing 4 at the time, and he was usually on 1 or 2 of my tables at least at the same time. And he was playing incredibly aggressive. I don't remember his stats, but I do know that basically every time we were in a pot together, he would be raising my C bets, check raising my C bets, 3 betting my check raises. I mean, he was just constantly finding aggression and applying aggression. And up until this hand, it had basically been working. I hadn't fought back in a single pot yet. Basically, it would be one level of aggression. He would take it to the next level, and I would kind of give in. So he was really putting the pedal to the metal, and he it was working for him. Oh, and the other thing is that a lot of the times when he was getting very aggressive, which I think is kind of important thing to remember, is the board textures that we were playing on. It's because he was really very often fighting back on board textures where nobody should have anything. Almost all of the pots that I can't remember the exact boards, but I can remember the impression that he was just constantly finding raises and 3 bets and check raises in these spots where it's really hard for either of us to have a hand. And when that's happening, when he's constantly able to do that, it is really sending off signals that he's probably getting out of line, and likely quite a bit out of line, because on those spots it's just, again, like I said, when it's a board texture like we're going to see here, where when you look at the whole range of hands, it's kind of hard for someone to have something. And if that keeps happening, that he keeps able to be applying that aggression, the odds are not in his favor to just have a hand every time. So that's a really quick, good indicator when you're using those kind of board texture reads, and you just keep seeing that aggression. Okay, so that being said here, we see the open. I 3-bet the king jack. He calls. Pretty standard on this board texture to just go for a 1/3 c-bet. It's one that I think this is a board that likely, actually, as we'll see in the analysis that I did, I think he is going to have more 7x than me by a decent amount. But overall, when you look at his whole range and when you look at my range, I think we're still doing quite well against him. And it's one where I'm just going to go ahead and go for this 1/3 c-bet with my whole range. And he pretty quickly check raises me. And right now with the king jack, I got 2 overs, backdoor flush. And we have the read that this guy's just kind of getting out of line. So I'm not really going anywhere just yet. And I make the call. We get to 3 on the turn. And he puts out kind of a curious bet size. I think with these stack sizes, and one thing that I kind of help me read hands is, does it really look like he's trying to play for stacks here? And when you see how deep we are, and you see that when I call, it's going to put just a slight overbet for him on the river. So technically, because he can overbet the river, he's still getting pretty close to playing for stacks. But to me, this kind of seemed like a pretty weak bet size, and one that could still be a pretty wide range. And I think my king high is ahead of a lot of that range. And we do have 2 options here. We can raise, and if he has ace highs that are betting again, probably get folds from those some of the time. If he has a hand like pocket 4s or pocket 5s here, probably get those to fold some of the time. I do think raising is worth considering here. It's not what I ended up doing. I ended up calling, and one of the big reasons that I ended up calling was because of my positional advantage. I'm kind of relying on that that when we get to the river, for him to give me some extra piece of information, either with his bet size or his timing of his bet or his check or, you know, something like that, or the board changes, where we still have some okay-ish stacks left to play for. We'll have a little bit more than a pot size bet on the river, and I'll have the position. And the fact that, like I said, because I think he's still kind of weak here, I ended up going for the call. So one thing I will say is that if we were running a PioSim and we node lock this to where he's getting way too aggressive on the flop, or way too aggressive on the flop and way too aggressive on the turn, we're going to be doing a ton of raising. And Pio is going to prefer raising quite a bit more to just calling here, because what happens is when we get to the river, you know, if I don't node lock all the streets, meaning that he's not making any mistakes on the river, he's still going to get to play very well and jam his value range in an appropriate amount of bluffs. And he's going to also get to realize his equity with his bluffs when we only have king high here. So what Pio's going to elect to do when he's raising, you know, let's say he's bluffing a bunch of ace X and he's bluffing a bunch of, you know, continuing to bet with things like pocket fives and fours and sixes and pocket eights and pocket nines and all that stuff. And, you know, we have a hand here that has some equity against those and can also apply a ton of pressure to that. Realistically, Pio's going to just start raising either on the flop or on the turn at a very high frequency when he's out of line. But because we're not against Pio or not against someone that is going to be playing perfect on the river and maybe give us some more information and allows us to use our positional advantage a little bit better, I opted to go for the call here. So I just wanted to point that out, that raising is likely going to be the most used option if we're in Pio land, but that's not what we did here. We're trying to take a little bit more exploitative approach to this situation. We get the 8 on the river, and he kind of does exactly what I was hoping, and does something that I think is a little bit telling of his hand strength. You know, I do think this is a bet size that is still definitely going to include some pocket 7, some 7x, some 3x, you know, occasionally quads, occasionally pocket 8s that got there. But when he doesn't jam here, I think this is a bet size that is going to end up being quite a bit weaker than a shove. Because of that, and because I still thought he was capable of having things like pocket 4s and 5s and 6s and just not really knowing what to do with them at this point. And so we kind of made this size a bet, and even maybe some things like, you know, ace X with a backdoor flush draw or ace X alternative flush draw, you know, because I still think he's going to be making this bet with a decent amount of hands that beat me. I actually elected to turn my hand into a bluff and put them all in here rather than call. And this is one spot where I was really torn here. And the main thing that we're going to focus on is, you know, we've kind of identified based on, one, his tendencies of just being way over aggressive in a lot of the spots we played before, based on his turn bet size, and based on his river bet size, that he's probably somewhat weak here. So is it better for us to just call here if we have those reads? Is jamming better, or are both bad, and should we have just folded here anyways, you know, regardless of the things that we picked up throughout the hand? I mean, it's because, like I said, he's still going to have 7x here. We're still losing the pot a decent chunk of the time, whether we call or jam. So are we losing it too often? And that's really what I wanted to look into for this analysis. We're going to break that down with a bunch of different things here. So the first thing, like I said, I wanted to touch on, a couple guys left some comments in the Discord, and I just kind of wanted to talk about them a little bit just to give my response to these guys. And also I think they brought up some points that are worth talking about a little bit as well. So one thing, if our hand is best the vast majority of the time, that definitely means that although, like for example, let's say I knew my hand was best 80% of the time on the river, I'm still not going to shove it for value, because when we see this line of, you know, I 3-bet pre-flop, I get check raise on the flop, I call the turn and then jam the river, I'm ripping an incredibly, incredibly strong range, which is part of the reason why I ended up doing it as a bluff. And I think that we're never, ever going to get called by worse. So if I know that my hand is best the vast majority of the time, that's going to end up making us just want to call on the river and call down. This is, I guess, one of the things that we're going to kind of test with our theory, like how often do we have the best hand versus, you know, maybe some of those pocket pairs or ace highs that should be in his range some of the time. So we're going to test that a little bit. I definitely wouldn't think, I would be careful about thinking in these type of terms. It does get very tempting when you're playing against maniacs to kind of just end up playing super passive and just let them bluff and bluff their stacks away. But you got to remember that when you have a hand like king high, anything he has going to have some equity against you. So while I do think that, sometimes taking the call down line is going to be very good for us, we want to make sure that we're not always thinking about, trying to extract value with super weak hands like that. Sometimes we want to be bluff raising or check raising or re-raising and things like that. And actually, if we're not taking a strategy against overly aggressive people of applying aggression back to them, it's going to actually turn out very nicely in their favor, because again, their bluffs are going to have equity and their bluffs are going to get there against us a decent percent of the time when we're just trying to call down with things as weak as king high. So we do want to make sure that we are fighting back with aggression as well some of the time. But like I talked about here, I opted to just try to take a more passive line because I felt that my position with the stack sizes we were going to have left on the river was going to net me maybe a little bit extra advantage than just trying to raise on the turn. But this next point here is, I think, a very important thing, a very important concept, and another reason why I didn't want to raise the turn, because we were a little deep still, and I don't just want to jam with my king jack. So if I did raise a turn, I'm kind of left with something like a min raise or like a 2.2x raise, which leaves him with the option of reshove. And if he reshoves, while I do think there's going to be some bluffs in there, I think it just kind of gives him another opportunity to win the pot. And so I guess the concept that I want to talk about is the last bet. And that's something that in poker is very, very important. And if you can, you always want to try to set yourself up to be the guy that gets to make that last bet. And so, for example, let's say we get to the turn and he bets, and maybe my raise is like, maybe if I jam, it's like 2.5x's raise. Well, that's a pretty nice jam. I get to be the one putting in the last bet. I get to put the pressure on all of his ace highs or weaker pairs and things like that. And I don't have to worry about the pressure being applied back to me. And, I think in GTO land, maybe being able to make that last bet isn't super powerful, but I think from because people are just gonna call with whatever percent of their range they need to and not have to worry about it, and play a perfect range. But I think in the realm of poker where it is now, where there's a lot of psychological, people still have a lot of how do I want to say this? There's psychology involved in poker still. There's human emotions and reactions and responses that are involved in poker. And, when you're forced to being the one calling for all of your chips, I think it actually ends up making people play quite a bit tighter, and it gives you quite a bit of power to be the one that gets to put them to that decision. So hopefully I kind of cover that as in a way that makes sense. But I didn't want to give him the option to be the guy that gets to put me all in for my chips. And I do understand that by, calling the turn, I do give him the option to donk shove the river. And at that point, I am going to be getting put in a tough spot. And I do understand the option that, when I do min raise, he doesn't always just shove. And, sometimes we just get the fold right away. So I'm not saying that raising would be bad just because of this, but I did want to talk about, not letting a player that I know is taking very aggressive lines and is always trying to reapply pressure to me. I didn't want to give him the option to put in that last bet when I only had king high and wasn't going to be able to probably have any idea what to do, so I'd just be forced to fold. The concept of the last bet, I think, is something that is worth thinking about, and it's also, one thing for you guys is worth setting it up for you if you're trying to take an aggressive aligned versus opponent. Set up a bet size where if he raises, you get the option to re-raise and make the last bet. Or, when you're going for check raise on the turn, or the river, make sure it's a size where when you check raise, you're getting to put in that last bet, things like that. It's quite powerful. Okay, so that was that part I wanted to talk about. The next thing, you have to have some solid reads for that play. I definitely agree with this, and I would say that it's actually probably the case that my reads, although we had played, I think at that point, for a couple hundred hands, and he was pretty consistent with his aggression. Obviously, I didn't have a perfect read on the guy, so it could definitely be argued that this is a little bit spew on my part. But I was pretty confident in my reads at the time, and I do for me, I think it's, pretty important in poker to just start testing your reads right away. And, I think I think the guy that's going to be willing to go with a read sooner is probably going to be the guy that's going to take the advantage sooner. I don't like just sitting back and waiting until we have thousands of hand and saying, okay, now I know how to play this guy, because I think you're missing some opportunities. So I would say that, although my reads on that guy weren't perfect, I had built enough of a history with him that I was, felt confident that it was time to maybe go with what I thought was going on. And I definitely think that you guys, if you feel something's going on, test it out. Find a way to test your theories and see if they're right or wrong, and put them to the test. But yeah, we're definitely taking an exploitative line here. This is not something that's going to show up in GTO, I don't think. I don't like the raise pre. I would say that I'm in strong disagreement with this. The King Jack 3-bet pre-flop suited should be standard for most of you guys, unless you're playing against maybe some of the tightest players in the world. And one thing that I wanted to pull up and show you guys real quick is a tool that you can use if you're working on building some pre-flop ranges. You can go to PokerSnowy. I think this is free for everybody. You go to their pre-flop advisor, which is where we're at here. I would say I've used PokerSnowy a little bit recently, both the pre-flop and the some of the post-flop analysis stuff. And while I don't agree with everything that they say, and if you look at some players and coaches that are much better than me, they'll probably say the same thing. But I do think it definitely gives you a good place to start. And I think if you were to play the ranges that it talks about here pre-flop, and if you were to play these ranges pretty well, I think it would be pretty tough to play against pre-flop. So I just wanted to kind of quickly show you guys this as a tool that you can use in your own game if you haven't already started messing around with it. So we'll lock it in my position, facing basically a 3x open. And what you can see here is everything that's in green is 100% 3-bet. And then if you see a number, that's the percent that it's 3-betting it. And then yellow means call. So if you see yellow with a number, it's 3-betting it 9% of the time, calling it the rest of the time. And what you can see here is that, King Jack is just 100% 3-bet in this range here. 3-betting down to 10s 100% of the time. And then obviously you're just branching out all over the place. And I do think, like I said, you can construct your ranges in quite a few different ways. And as you'll see from the range that I constructed against this type of player that I'm playing against, it's quite a bit different than this. But even still, King Jack is going to be a very, very, very high frequency. And in fact, against this guy, King Jack is going to be 100% 3-bet for me. It's just a hand that when we go back here, players from the small blind should be, so PokerSnowy plays a mixed strategy of limping and raising. So let's just say that they're basically raising, all the ace-x, all of these hands out here that are limping and raising are probably raising 100% of the time. Probably let's just assume that they're raising something like this. And this guy was really aggressive, so he might even actually be raising more, more of the Queen X and more of the suited cards over here. When you're up against that range that's that wide, King Jack is doing incredibly well. And also players in these spots, one thing is, from my perspective, King Jack suited against this type of player is actually a hand that can call a 4-bet unless he's making it an enormous size. But we're still deep. I've got a suited hand. I've got position. So we're not 3-betting to fold. We're actually 3-betting to call. Like I said, unless he makes it just ridiculously large. But most of the time, he's still going to just defend by calling, in which case King Jack is still doing amazingly well. And if they fold, that's still making a pretty good big blind per 100 for King Jack suited for sure. So realistically, obviously if he 4-bets, we're kind of hating life. And it's, a very marginal, very, very, very marginal call, but it's still one that we can make. But really, realistically, in any situation, no matter what happens, after we 3-bet King Jack, we're still likely to make some money in the long run. And so because of that, I think that King Jack just belongs in your 3-bet range. Again, like I said, unless you're playing against someone that's just way too tight, because now if they do 4-bet you, you can't call. If they do call you, their range is now very strong because one, their opening range is really tight, and then when they're calling the 3-bet, their range is really tight. So you're not doing great against their calling range anymore. And because their opening range was so tight to begin with, you're probably not getting a ton of folds either. So, against a really, really tight player, King Jack suited becomes a call. But, people play aggressive ranges in the small blind. Pretty much everybody does these days. So I would definitely say that we want to be 3-betting King Jack at a high frequency. King Jack suited. King Jack off, I don't remember what it said there, but for me is almost always just a call until, we develop some sort of reads against the player. Flop's pretty standard. I agree. On the turn, he pretty much agrees. We could be ahead because he's getting out of line. Agreed. And then on the river, I'm not sure about the jam. And again, this is basically what this whole video is going to be about. And he actually kind of had some of the same questions that I did. Why don't we just call with the king high here? If we really think we are ahead, aren't we ahead enough where we can just call? And he's also worried about things like ace high or 8x or, pocket 6s or pocket 7s, that type of stuff. Sometimes they're just going to call. And I do think that is a little bit of a worry. I would say here, to go back to the replayer one last time, he's left with a half of a buy-in left. If he was left with like $20 or 20 big blinds, in a 300 big blind pot, then I think that's a big different story. But I think there is still some psychological effects that are happening when, one, I'm repping a very strong range and he's still got to make a call for a half a buy-in even though the pot's pretty big. So if stacks were a little bit shallower, I think our fold equity would be a little bit less, even though I do think we would still have some because our line does rep quite a bit of strength. I mean, from your guys' perspective, imagine you're sitting here with even a 3 and you're making this size bet and then I jam here. You're probably going to end up calling. I doubt you're going to fold for the pot, but you're going to hate it, right? And any time that's ever happened to you and you've had kind of the second nuts or the third nuts, you've really hated life in this kind of a situation when you get jammed on. So, if you kind of think about it from that perspective of how these kind of jams on the river, how they've affected you and, the strength of hands that you've been willing to fold in that spot. Although this guy is getting out of line, I think we're still kind of putting him in that spot. So I don't expect many calls, if any, from those type of hands, but we're going to give some wiggle room for some doubt. We'll say that. But again, we got to keep in mind that he is still having to put in a half a buy-in, which has some significance. And I did want to point that as well. And yeah, I think I've done enough talking without actually posting up numbers and stuff here. So it's time to first get into Pio real quick, and then we're going to move over to CardRunnerEV and dig into that. So the first thing here, I kept it at a very simple tree. I just want to do, one thing I always want to do is when, I say someone's getting out of line, I want to check and make sure, are they really able to get out of line? If Pio's super insanely aggressive in a spot, that means that really they're not capable of getting out of line if they're being super aggressive in a spot, and I need to readjust what I think is out of line and in line kind of a thing. So the first thing I want to do is just kind of check Pio and see what out of line actually would look like. And that's what we're using this for. The first thing I wanted to show is, like I said, my 3-bet range is going to get very, very different versus a player like this, focusing really heavy on value. And you can see I'm actually going down to King 10 suited, Ace 10 suited for value against this guy. Basically, I'm considering kind of my whole range value and something where most of it would actually end up being able to call or 5-bet against his 4-bet. Some of these things here you see in a low frequency, depending on, if his 4-bet's tiny, then I wouldn't fold anything. But if he makes like a decent sized 4-bet, then some of these gappers might fold, and maybe something like the Queen 9s and definitely these offsuit hands would fold here. But I'm certainly never folding any of my A6 suited. My suited connectors aren't folding, and my pocket pairs, when we're this deep, until he gets to a substantial 4-bet size, aren't folding either. So my 3-bet range here is designed to be able to continue for the most part no matter what happens, and designed to just have a really, really high equity against his continuing range. And at some point, if I notice that he's starting to fold a little bit more, then we'll go more towards a range of like what you saw with the Poker Snowy. This is kind of my best guess at what his calling range would look like. A little bit was built off of, you know, just what a calling range should look like in general, which is all the stuff that you see at the 100% or high percent is really what most people should be calling with anyways in these spots. And then just kind of extending it because, like I said, I do think that he's getting a little bit wider than what your normal player would do. These hands are actually a little bit wider as well. Some of these fold pre-flop, but I wanted to also give him a lot of 7x because I think that this is a player that is probably going to be calling the 3-bet more often than other players would. And if he has a bunch of 7x, you know, can he get away with just going crazy against us? That's something we want to test here. So I maybe gave him slightly more 7x than he actually would have, but, you know, we gave him some of these. I think if he has ace-7 off, he probably has all the ace-x off. So I wanted to make sure to add in all those down there. And realistically, if he's going to fold any of these 7x, it would probably be like the queen-7 and maybe the jack-7 and the 10-7, but probably the rest of them are going to be calling. And even these I think I'll call some of the time. So anyways, this is just kind of a guess at the range that he might be continuing with. And he's always going to check to us. And you can see here, obviously, you know, if we are only betting 1/3, we just get to bet basically 100% of the time, which is something that is going to happen quite a bit when we just have such an equity advantage here because of our nice strong range that we 3-bet with pre-flop. Even when he has all those 7x, I mean, we're just, against his really wide range, we're just piling on the equity here. All right, and so the first thing you can see is that because of all his 7x, he gets to check raise us a ton of the time. And, you know, this is what we want to test. Like, do we think that this player is actually going to check raise more than this? Or is he going to check raise less than this? My impression was that he was actually probably going to still be check raising even more than this percent here. And also a tendency that you see with really aggressive players is they probably slow play more than they should. I'm not saying that he's going to slow play at any super high frequency, but I think we'll actually see here where you see, you know, close to 100% of the 7x and the really strong hands are being check raised here. I think we'll actually see some slow plays in this pot, probably more than what Pio was showing. When I did my CardRunnerEV sims, I actually kept it roughly the same frequency. I didn't mess with it just to keep it somewhat similar. But that's something that you want to be watching out for, and something that makes it really easy to make light call downs against players is, and I used to run into players when I played heads up that were horrendous, like they would slow play 50+% of the time, but then we're always finding ways to check raise and barrel off. You know, if you could find a player that loves to slow play, but is also aggressive all the time, you know, you own that guy because he's never going to have the nuts. So very good to keep an eye on. I didn't know that about this guy, but it's just a tendency that just pops up all the time against really aggressive players. Like I said, I actually thought that he was going to be check raising more than this percent here. How much more, I don't know. So I actually didn't turn it up too much. What I did was basically here where he's check raising a high frequency of hands, on all these, I just put it at 100% for the first sim that we'll see. And if it was something like, you know, this, I turned it up to 80%. So basically what I did was have him still check raising basically the same hands that Pio was, but at just a slightly higher percent. So we didn't change it too much for the first Card Runners trial. And then the second one, I changed the combos around a little bit so he doesn't have so many ace highs. And I moved it down to here, but still left roughly the same percent of check raises. And we just let him like fold all these stuff, which makes sense. So that's really all we're going to use Pio for. I guess real quick we'll check here. So let's say he is check raising this, you know, 26% and has all these 7x in his check raising range. We still see here that the king jack suited is just slightly better than a break-even call. So even against someone who's not being too aggressive, who's check raising a perfect range, we're still calling with the king jack here. When we get to the turn, you know, he gets to just keep betting a very high frequency, and at that point, we need some sort of exploitative tendencies, something going on to make us be able to call here. But it's actually still relatively close enough, in fact, that Pio is calling 1.7% of the time here. finding it, because it needs to dig down into its range a little bit more than the zero range in order to defend enough. We see that the king jack of spades even is sometimes defending. So you can see here, if one, the check raises on the flop he's slow playing a little bit too much, which means his check raises are a little more imbalanced towards bluffs. Boom, we have an easy call. Or if he's still check raising the same amount of 7x, but bluffing, just adding in more bluffs, once we get to the turn, we have an easy call as well. So realistically, basically what this shows me is he doesn't need to be getting too out of line in order for this to be tilted quite a bit more towards a call. And then what you'll see is if he gets really out of line, then we're probably raising, like I said earlier, we're going to end up raising a lot more on the flop. And, if he's continuing to get out of line on the turn, we're going to end up raising a lot more on the turn if he's really, really out of line. But we're going to leave that for maybe a different analysis, because the main focus of this one is on the river. So, okay, so here's the first one. I basically started it up on the turn just to make things easier, and you can see I brought over a bunch of the ranges, kind of like what I talked about. Kept it very similar to what Pio was doing when it's getting to the turn. So even though it shows like it has 100% of these hands in here, keep in mind that there's a lot of weighting going on here, even some down to only 0.5% weighting. We have the kings in here at the 0.5, so kept it reasonable, but more aggressive than what Pio was doing. And on the turn, basically, I actually am having him continue with 85% of his 7x or pocket threes, or 3x, 7x, pocket threes, pocket sevens. I'm having him continue with 85%. And one thing that I touched on a little bit earlier is I kind of felt like this bet was a little bit weak, and it's going to be actually more likely that he isn't betting these hands. So I think we're actually giving him too many 7x combos by just a little bit. But I do like to be a little bit pessimistic with my assumptions, so I kind of left this high. One thing I did, I guess these are a little bit optimistic on the assumptions, is that I actually don't know if this is super optimistic. His bet size on the turn here is definitely one that can I think make sense with this kind of hand strength. When we get the 3 turn, not really wanting to check call, not really wanting to check fold, so kind of putting out kind of a weakish bet with hands that he still thinks is doing okay versus my range. It makes some sense. So maybe the 4s and 5s are a little bit less, but we still have him at 100%. Maybe this is a little bit less here. Flush draws, I think, are continuing at a high frequency. The gut shots, if he did check raise those, are probably gonna keep betting. And then I left him with half of the combos that bluffed on the flop to continue betting on the turn. I think for someone who is getting out of line, that's going to be reasonable. But you can see here, if this is the case, let's say he's betting, let's say these two are value and these are bluffs, he's definitely over bluffing at this point. So got to keep that in mind. And then when we get to the turn or the river, we're going to start adding in the variables here. So the first thing I said was this bet size is indicative of not actually having a full house, of the not all in sizing. So we're going to see like how often is he actually shoving the full house here. And then the next thing, I just left these as standards. I said he's going to bet his one pair hands 50% of the time for this size. It's going to be hard to be super accurate with these numbers here, but I just wanted to give something that might be close, and at least something that we can, start making some assumptions. Once we see the actual numbers, we can start kind of making some assumptions and see where we lie. And as far as bluffs, I just put them at 70% of all the hands that get to the river, and I didn't discern whether it was an ace-x or something else. I just let him decide to basically 70% of all those. And one thing you'll see here is that, already looking at this, we can probably see that if he's going to be betting this many ace-x and this many pairs, probably calling isn't going to be a good option for us. So we're very likely going to end up raising, depending on some factors. So Obviously, if we do jam, he's going to always call with a full house or better. And then this is a variable that we're going to have for when he's calling with ace high or better. So any of his pairs over the 3 or ace high, because those are all roughly the same hand strength relative to my value range that's jamming. So I have this in here, and we're going to kind of mess with those. So the first thing, actually, before we go into that, we're going to test the call. And basically what I'm saying is he's probably always at least betting, 20% of his 7x for this sizing. I don't think if he is going to have multiple sizings on the river, which realistically I don't think he should. I think he should be jamming or just checking. But, let's say if he is going to use multiple sizings, then he probably wants to have, something around 20% or more of the 7x. And so we left it in here. And then I'm going to say that he's never going over 90% of the 7x, meaning that if he is going to have 2 sizings, at least 10% of the time he's going to jam with the 7x. And so we're just going to kind of see the numbers, the EV of our call, depending on these variables and leaving these as a constant. And basically what you can see here is if this is the range, we never have a plus EV call on the river. And it's because he's still so heavy with his bluffs with ace highs and the pocket pairs that we have in there versus kind of a range. And so basically we need this to probably have 5% only of the 7x and then the rest bluffs, and we'll probably get closer to 0 EV. But to me, this just doesn't seem like a scenario with all these conditions that we would ever want to call. The other thing that could change is obviously if these pairs drop down to 20% of the time or something like that, then the call is going to get better. But realistically, looking at those numbers against this range that I think seems like a very reasonable and easy to get to flop check raise range, because it's just the hands that make the most sense, I kind of feel that trying to find a call on the river here versus this setup, it doesn't seem super ideal for us. So the next thing we want to check is versus if we get to shove and get some folds now, if we can actually make some plus EV decisions here. So the next one. Okay, so here, if this is 0, that means he's never calling. And if it's 50, that means he's calling 50% of the time. And basically what I'm saying here is I don't expect him to call more than half the time with his ace high or, weak pocket pairs. I guess we could bump it up to, we'll bump it up to 60 just for fun. But I really think we're getting more, I think we're probably getting actually close to down to here of him almost always folding. But for some of you guys that are a little bit skeptical, at least you can see some of these numbers up here. And so the way to read this, variable 1 is his value range with the 7x. So as you can see, the higher the number, the lower our EV goes. We go from having an EV of 50 to having an EV of 20. And variable 2 is how often he's calling. So this means he's never calling all the way up to he's calling at 60%. And basically what we want to do is look for the worst case scenario. So let's say he's always got his 7x. If he's calling more than 40% of the time with his ace highs and things like that, then obviously we're pushing ourselves in a negative EV. But again, I think we're going to be, probably closer and do something like this range here, which you could see we're just making actually quite a bit of money with the jam. But let's be pessimistic. And let's move it a couple clicks to the right and a couple clicks down, just because, again, these are all assumptions here and they could be definitely really wrong. So even if we're 1, 2, 3 here, 1, 2, 3, we're still doing way, way better than calling for sure and infinitely better than folding. Well, folding is better than calling. So I think we can see here, if this is the range that we're up against, then jamming is definitely going to be our best option. And it's not even close. But hopefully one thing you guys saw for those of you who use CardRunnerEV is this is definitely a way that I use it to study is, you got to recognize that your assumptions aren't going to be perfect. And so I definitely will always do that of like, guess, like I said, maybe this is where we're probably going to be. And then I go to quite a bit more pessimistic, area. And if we're still plus EV, then I just think that there's probably no way that we're not making money with this jam. And when we saw with the call assumption, where we're always losing money, that means that there's just no comparison here. Against this type of setup, we're always wanting to shove the river when we get this opportunity. So the other thing I wanted to kind of compare is, because this is kind of an out-of-line player, one thing that's going to happen is I think out-of-line players aren't going to try to follow what Pio was saying, meaning that when they're, check raising, not only is their frequency higher than what Pio would be, but it's made up of hands that Pio would never have, because they're just kind of just trying to be aggressive. And so what I did was I reduced the combos of ace high pretty significantly, taking away from these ace queen, ace jack, ace queen, ace jack. I reduced the frequency of these, and then I added in all this stuff in here, which Pio pretty much never had, still only having the backdoor flush options. And it was pretty close to the same amount of combos and the same percent of hands, but the makeup of the range changed quite a bit. And because again we're testing assumptions, I don't know if his range is going to look like what Pio did, but a little more aggressive, or like this one. So we're going to kind of compare the two and try to end up somewhere in the middle, basically, between the two ranges. And everything else I just left the same, didn't mess with anything. And so the first thing here, we're going to pop this guy up top. All right, and so even against this kind of range makeup, we need him to be slow playing. So this means he's betting 60%, so he's slow playing 40%. 55, he's slow playing. So we need him to be slow playing 45% of the time or more. And I'm not super confident that we're actually going to be getting that. Or again, deciding to find bluffs with non-ace high a little more often and non-pairs a little more often, which I definitely think is possible. But realistically, this isn't looking super promising when we see that, half of the time, versus these different things, we're dipping into the negative. So it looks to me here like still calling isn't looking to be the super slam dunk option. And we can see in this case, it actually is almost never negative. I mean, we have to get all the way down to here, meaning even though he actually has quite a few more hands in his range that we're beating by calling anyways, it also means he has less ace highs and things that can call us down. So it's harder for him to make these calls. And so you're seeing it's just quite difficult for us to not be plus EV with a jam. And I would say likely impossible. Whereas with a call, we kind of showed it's somewhat possible for us to dip into the negative EV. And so comparing all these options, I think with the king high in our hand, from everything that I've seen here, I think we're just way more plus EV. And actually, in my mind, this was a very, very close decision. And like I said at the beginning of the video, something that I just didn't know what the best option was going to be. And, looking at these numbers, even though we're making a ton of assumptions, I can just tell here that jamming is by far our best option in this situation. And I think folding would be our next best option. So if we're not, confident enough in our exploit here to make the shove, I think we would just want to fold here, which is actually somewhat surprising. I thought it was going to go jam and call close and then fold be the last option. So I think this is something that's kind of pretty cool. And I just want to keep pointing it out, but a decent chunk of it hinges on the fact that we are expecting him to be betting his one pair hands at a decent frequency across the turn and the river, which I think against this player type is actually pretty fair. Had he shoved, I think the assumption would be quite a bit different. But with the smaller bet sizing, it seems a little more fair. So that was the hand, guys. I think it, like I said, it's definitely a very, very rare spot, but hopefully it touched on some cool concepts and some ideas for you guys to think about. Maybe gave you a small tutorial on how to use CardRunnerEV to study some exploitative spots against players in your field that you're playing against. Yeah, that's going to wrap it up. So thank you very much for watching, guys. Really appreciate it. And as always, good luck at the tables until the next video, guys. Take it easy.